He left people behind and built a strange house with a canopy right in a cave. But every time he returned, he found it destroyed. His neighbors thought he would simply disappear. They didn't know that he could see everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. For most of his life, he had been a man measured by other people's needs. His hands, darkened by sun and scarred by labor, had shaped walls he would never sleep behind, and roofs he would never hear rain strike in the quiet of night. Decades had passed that way, one job blending into another, one address replaced by the next. He had learned early that the world valued his strength more than his presence. When the work was finished, he was thanked, paid, and forgotten, left to move on with his tools and the weight of another temporary existence. He had grown used to that rhythm, though he never learned to love it. There was always a sense of standing just outside something permanent, as if stability were a room whose door remained closed to him. Apartments came and went. Shared houses, rented rooms, places that were never truly his, followed one another in an unbroken line. He paid on time, kept quiet, caused no trouble, and yet he was always aware that at any moment, the place he slept could be taken back by someone else's decision. It wasn't wealth he dreamed of when he allowed himself to imagine a different life. He did not picture a large house or land stretching far beyond sight. What he wanted was simpler and far more elusive. He wanted silence that was not empty, quiet that did not feel borrowed. He wanted to wake without listening for footsteps that were not his own, to rest without feeling that his presence was conditional. Above all, he wanted to build something that could not be taken from him by a notice on a door or a change in rent. The thought took years to harden into resolve. It arrived gradually, carried by exhaustion rather than anger. One evening, after another long day repairing a structure that would shelter strangers he would never meet again, he sat alone and understood with sudden clarity that if he did not change the course of his life soon, he never would. His body was already heavy with years of work. His hands would not remain strong forever. If he waited longer, the chance to build something of his own would pass with the rest of his strength. He sold what little he owned that tied him to the city. The process was quiet and unceremonious. Tools he no longer needed went first, then furniture that had followed him from place to place without ever making a home. When the time came to leave, there was no one to say goodbye to, no room to empty that felt like a loss. He loaded his truck with supplies, boards, nails, and what provisions he could afford, and drove away without looking back. He did not choose his destination on a map. He chose it with his feet. For weeks, he traveled through stretches of forest and rock, walking where roads faded into narrow paths and then into nothing at all. He paid attention to the land the way he had learned to pay attention to buildings, reading signs of stability and weakness, listening to how the earth responded under his steps. He followed water when he could, knowing it was life, but also knowing it could become danger if it turned wild. It was during one of those long explorations that he found the place that would change everything. The forest opened unexpectedly, revealing a massive stone formation that rose like a frozen wave. At its base yawned a wide, natural opening, not a narrow cave but a vast hollow shaped by time. Light reached deep inside, reflecting off shallow water that flowed calmly across the stone floor. The air was cool but not cold, still but not stale. Sound behaved differently there, softened and slowed, as if the stone itself absorbed excess noise. He stood at the threshold for a long time, listening. Wind moved through the trees outside, but inside the cavern it arrived as a whisper. Rain, when it fell later that afternoon, struck the stone above and flowed gently along the walls, never reaching the center. The place felt ancient, enduring, as if it had witnessed centuries without changing its nature. The idea formed quietly, not to hide inside the stone, but to live with it. He imagined a small wooden house set back from the entrance, protected by the vault of rock, but still open to light and water. The stone would not press in on the structure, but stand behind it, offering shelter without confinement. It would be a partnership rather than a conquest. He returned with his truck and began the work that would define the next chapter of his life. The foundation came first, carefully placed stones, leveled and reinforced so the house would sit steady even as the seasons changed. He chose each beam with care, cutting and shaping the wood so it rested naturally against the uneven surfaces of the cavern floor. The walls rose slowly, one measured piece at a time, guided by experience earned over a lifetime of building for others. The roof was simple but strong, slanted just enough to guide moisture away. At the front, he erected a wide wooden canopy supported by thick posts, anchored deep into the ground. This structure was more than decoration. It marked a boundary, a place where the outside world ended and his own space began. Beneath it, he built a small platform where he could sit and work, sheltered from rain and snow alike. A narrow wooden walkway stretched from the platform across the shallow water to solid ground. It was the only path to the house, intentional in its simplicity. Anyone who approached would have to cross it, step by step, leaving no doubt of their presence. He liked that. It made the approach deliberate, not accidental. As autumn settled over the forest, the house took on a life of its own. Leaves drifted down from the trees above, collecting on the canopy roof and along the edges of the walkway. The water beneath reflected gold and rust, broken only by the slow movement of fish. Inside, the air held a steady warmth once he lit the stove for the first time. The stone walls behind the house retained heat, releasing it slowly through the night. His days found a rhythm that felt natural, unforced. He woke with the light, brewed coffee on the stove, and stepped out beneath the canopy to watch mist rise from the water. He worked steadily, improving small details, adjusting beams that shifted as the wood settled. Meals were simple, eaten without hurry. In the evenings, he sat beneath the stone vault and listened to the forest quiet itself, feeling for the first time that the silence belonged to him. The sense of peace surprised him with its depth. It was not joy in the loud sense, not something that demanded expression. It was steadier than that, a calm that settled into his bones. He slept deeply, untroubled by the sounds that once would have kept him alert in unfamiliar places. Yet even in those early weeks, a subtle awareness lingered at the edge of his contentment. He knew too much about the world to believe peace was guaranteed, simply because it was desired. The house was strong, the stone older and more enduring than any structure he could build, but happiness had taught him caution. He did not name the feeling, but it remained with him, a quiet reminder that what was newly gained could still be tested. As the days grew shorter and the forest darkened earlier each evening, he found himself paying closer attention to the boundary marked by the walkway and the canopy. It was nothing more than awareness, a habit carried over from years of vigilance. He told himself it was only that. The place was remote. No one had reason to come this far. Still, when he stood beneath the stone vault and looked at the small house he had built with his own hands, he understood that this peace, however real, was fragile simply because it mattered. And somewhere beyond the trees, unseen and unnamed, the world remained capable of reaching even into places shaped by stone and silence. The peace he had found beneath the stone vault did not vanish all at once. It thinned gradually, like mist lifting from the water, so slowly that at first he hardly noticed the change. Autumn deepened around the house, the forest shifting from gold to copper, then to darker shades as the leaves dried and fell. The air grew sharper in the mornings, and the water beneath the walkway carried a colder touch when he knelt to rinse his hands. Despite the remoteness of the place, he could not live entirely apart from the world. Once a week, sometimes once every 10 days, he drove his old truck into the nearest town. The road was narrow and uneven, winding through trees and rock, and by the time he reached pavement, he already felt like a visitor returning from another century. He bought flour, oil, canned goods, lamp fuel, nails, and anything else that could not be fashioned by hand. He spoke little, answering questions briefly, nodding when greeted, keeping his eyes forward. The townspeople noticed him, of course. A man living alone in the forest, in a house built into stone, was not something easily ignored. Some looked at him with mild curiosity, others with the faint unease reserved for those who choose solitude too openly. He felt their eyes follow him through the store aisles, felt conversations soften when he passed. It was not hostility, not exactly, but distance. He had learned long ago not to take such things personally. He paid, loaded his truck, and left. The first sign that something was wrong came after one of these trips. He returned in the late afternoon, the sky already dimming beneath a blanket of clouds. As he crossed the walkway, he noticed a board near the edge that had shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable, and at first he thought the wood had simply warped with moisture. Only when he stepped onto the platform beneath the canopy did he see the small scatter of splintered wood near the base of one of the posts. Inside, one of the front windows was cracked. The glass had not shattered completely, but a spiderweb of fractures spread from a single point near the center. He stood for a long moment, studying it, trying to reconstruct how it might have happened. A falling branch, perhaps, carried by wind. The forest was full of such hazards. He told himself there was no reason to assume otherwise. He replaced the pane the next morning. The work was simple, almost meditative, and by the time he finished, the unease he had felt the night before had dulled. The house looked whole again. The stone walls stood unchanged. The water flowed as calmly as ever. Whatever had happened, it was over. A week later, it happened again. This time, the damage was to the walkway. 2 boards near the center had been pulled loose, their nails bent as if yanked upward rather than driven out by stress. One board had fallen partially into the water, floating at an angle, bumping softly against the stone below. He knelt beside it, fingers tracing the warped metal. Nails did not bend like that on their own. Still, he did not allow himself to jump to conclusions. The mind, he knew, could invent enemies where none existed, especially in solitude. He repaired the boards carefully, reinforcing them more than necessary, and told himself that if it happened again, he would think harder about the cause. It did happen again. When he returned the 3rd time, the house felt wrong before he even stepped inside. The canopy posts were streaked with mud, and dark footprints marked the platform where he usually sat in the evenings. His chest tightened as he followed the marks to the door. Inside, the table had been overturned. One of the chairs knocked onto its side. A small shelf had been pulled from the wall, its contents scattered across the floor. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the quiet aftermath, and felt a familiar anger rise. It was not explosive. It was the slow, heavy kind that came from having something taken without permission. This was not the chaos of nature. This was intrusion. That night he slept poorly. Every sound carried farther within the stone walls, amplified and reshaped by the cavern. A drip of water echoed like footsteps. The rustle of leaves outside sounded closer than it was. He rose more than once, lantern in hand, scanning the shadows beneath the canopy, listening for movement beyond the water. In the days that followed, autumn darkened further. Rain came more often, and with it came more signs of disturbance. A post beneath the canopy was scratched, as if struck deliberately. The door bore a shallow mark, not deep enough to break the wood, but enough to suggest force. Once, he found crude markings smeared across the outer wall, washed pale by rain, but still visible in places. Each incident left him more unsettled than the last. He scrubbed, repaired, replaced, always restoring the house to order. Yet the knowledge that someone else had been there lingered long after the damage was gone. The stone vault that had once felt protective now seemed to hold the memories of intrusion, echoing them back at him when the nights grew quiet. He began to watch more closely when he went to town. He noticed young men gathered near the store, laughing loudly, glancing at him when they thought he was not looking. He told himself he was imagining it, that suspicion could grow like a weed if left unchecked. But the feeling did not leave him. As autumn edged closer to winter, the sense of being tested grew stronger. The damage did not stop. Sometimes it was small, a broken step, a loose hinge. Other times it was more deliberate, as if meant to send a message. He found himself standing beneath the canopy more often, looking out across the water, listening not for the forest, but for signs of human presence. He did not consider leaving. The thought crossed his mind only once, briefly, and he dismissed it as quickly as it came. He had not come this far to retreat at the first challenge. Too much of his life had already been spent yielding ground to others. Instead, he began to change his habits. He stayed longer in the house after returning from town, listening before unpacking. He slept lighter, axe resting closer to the bed. He traced the edges of the walkway and platform each morning, looking for signs he might have missed. Autumn, which had begun as a season of warmth and promise, settled into something heavier. The forest grew quiet in a way that felt watchful rather than peaceful. Leaves piled thick beneath the trees, muffling sound, hiding tracks. And beneath the stone vault, in the house he had built to escape the world, he understood at last that the world had found him anyway. The first snow arrived quietly, as if the forest itself wished not to draw attention to the change. It fell during the night in fine, dry flakes that clung to branches and settled on stone without sound. When he woke and stepped beneath the canopy, the world beyond the water looked unfamiliar, softened, almost erased. The walkway was dusted white, each board outlined clearly, and the shallow water below moved slower now, its surface broken by thin plates of forming ice near the edges. Winter did not announce itself with drama. It simply took possession. He adjusted his routines instinctively. Firewood was stacked closer to the house. Supplies were inventoried with greater care. Trips to town became rarer, calculated against weather and daylight. The road that led back to civilization grew treacherous after storms, and he knew that once snow settled deeply, leaving would become a risk rather than a chore. The isolation he had once welcomed now demanded respect. With winter came a change in the intrusions. They grew bolder. The first serious damage occurred after a particularly long absence. Snow had fallen steadily for 2 days, making the drive slow and exhausting. When he finally returned, dusk already pressing close, he sensed something wrong before he reached the platform. The walkway had been tampered with again, this time more deliberately. One section near the middle sagged unnaturally. The supports beneath loosened. It would not have collapsed under careful steps, but it could have given way if crossed in haste. The thought unsettled him deeply. This was no longer careless destruction. Someone had altered the structure in a way that could have caused harm. Inside the house, he found the door frame splintered at one corner. the wood gouged as if struck repeatedly. A shelf lay broken on the floor, its contents scattered and crushed under boots. Snow had been tracked inside, melting into muddy streaks that spread across the boards. The intrusion felt intimate now, invasive in a way that reached beyond objects and into the space he occupied. He repaired the damage with hands that moved on habit, while his thoughts worked relentlessly. The cold seeped deeper into the cavern as the sun vanished early, and the stone walls that once held warmth now radiated a steady chill. At night, the wind outside carried strange sounds, filtered through the cave's mouth and reshaped by the rock until they became something else entirely. He slept lightly, waking at the slightest noise, listening to the silence between sounds for signs of movement. Winter tightened its grip quickly. Ice spread across the water beneath the walkway, thick enough to dull sound, but not strong enough to walk on safely. Snow piled against the outer stone, narrowing the entrance to the cavern. The world beyond his small domain faded, leaving only the forest, the stone, and the house. The intrusions continued. Sometimes they came close together, sometimes after days of uneasy calm. A broken window, a door left ajar. Once, he found a crude symbol scratched into one of the canopy posts, half hidden beneath frost. He scrubbed it away, but the knowledge of its presence lingered long after the wood was clean. He began to understand something he had resisted admitting. Whoever was doing this knew his patterns. They knew when he left, how long he stayed away, and when he would return. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. The realization changed something inside him. He stopped pretending patience alone would protect him. Endurance had carried him through many things in life, but endurance without awareness was only another form of vulnerability. He needed to see what was happening when he was not there. He needed proof, not only to satisfy his own doubts, but to anchor his thoughts against the creeping fear that solitude could breed. On his next trip to town, he bought the cameras. They were small, simple devices, easy to conceal. He chose them carefully, asking few questions, paying in cash. The clerk barely looked at him, and he was glad for it. He did not want attention attached to this purchase. Whatever truth the cameras revealed, it would belong to him first. Installing them took time and care. He studied the cavern as if seeing it anew, noting how shadows fell beneath the stone vault, how light moved across the water during the day and vanished completely at night. He placed one camera high beneath the canopy, angled to capture the platform, the door, and the start of the walkway. Another he set deeper in the stone, hidden in a natural crevice where the rock curved inward, offering a view of the approach from the forest path. A third he positioned low, near the waterline, where reflections could betray movement even in darkness. The stone that had once amplified his unease now became an ally. It hid what he wished hidden and revealed what mattered. Once the cameras were in place, he tested them repeatedly, leaving the house and returning, walking across the platform, opening the door, moving through the space exactly as an intruder might. Each time, the images recorded faithfully. The devices watched without judgment, without fear. With that, a new kind of waiting began. He continued his routines, though each action carried a sharpened awareness. When he left for town, he turned the cameras on with deliberate care. When he returned, he checked the house before unloading the truck, scanning for signs of disturbance. Some days, nothing had changed. On others, the familiar signs of intrusion greeted him, and with them came a steady, controlled resolve. The winter nights grew longer. Storms pressed against the stone, their fury softened by the cavern's shelter, but never entirely silenced. Snow buried tracks quickly, erasing evidence before he could study it. More than once, he stood beneath the canopy during a snowfall, watching flakes vanish into the dark water. feeling the weight of being alone with a threat he could not yet name. The turning point came after one of the harshest storms of the season. The drive back from town had been slow and dangerous, and he arrived exhausted, shoulders stiff with cold. The sight that awaited him drained what little warmth remained. The walkway had been damaged again, this time with clear intent. Several boards had been loosened and pushed aside, leaving gaps wide enough to catch a foot. The canopy post nearest the water bore deep marks, gouges that spoke of repeated strikes. Inside, the table had been shoved against the wall, and one of the chairs lay broken beyond repair. He did not react immediately. He set down his supplies, removed his coat, and lit the lamp with steady hands. Only then did he retrieve the small device hidden in the stone and bring it inside. The images loaded slowly, each second stretching tight with anticipation. He watched from the beginning, his own departure replayed in silence. Hours passed in accelerated motion, shadows shifting, light fading. Then movement. Figures emerged from the forest path, their shapes distorted by distance and darkness, but unmistakably human. They moved with confidence, not caution, stepping onto the walkway as if they had done it before. He leaned closer, heart steady, but heavy. The cameras showed everything. 3 figures, young, their movements careless, almost playful. They laughed, shoved one another, took turns damaging the structure. One struck the canopy post with a tool, another pried at the walkway boards, the third kicked at the door with reckless force. They moved freely beneath the stone vault, unafraid, unhurried. He watched until the end, until they disappeared back into the trees, leaving destruction in their wake. When the screen went dark, he sat very still. The truth settled into him with a weight that felt both crushing and clarifying. This was not random. This was not the forest, not chance, not misunderstanding. It was deliberate, repeated cruelty carried out by those who saw his solitude as an invitation. Winter had closed the exits around his home, but it had also closed the door on denial. He no longer wondered what he was facing. He knew, and knowing, he understood, was the beginning of something else entirely. He did not stop watching the footage when the figures disappeared into the trees. He rewound it and watched again, slower this time, forcing himself to see every detail he had missed in the first rush of recognition. The cameras did not lie, but the truth they offered demanded patience. He studied the way the boys moved, the careless confidence in their steps, the way one of them leaned casually against a canopy post, while another pried at the walkway boards. They behaved not like intruders afraid of discovery, but like owners returning to a place they believed belonged to them. He watched their faces as the camera angle shifted, catching them in the pale wash of reflected snowlight. They were younger than he had expected, not children, but not yet men either. Their features still carried the softness of youth, though it was already hardening into something sharper, more brittle. He recognized them then, not with certainty at first, but with a dull familiarity that grew heavier with each replay. He had seen them in town, loitering near the store, their laughter too loud, their glances lingering on him with a curiosity that had once seemed harmless. The knowledge settled in his chest like cold iron. These were not strangers who had stumbled upon his home. They had noticed him. They had followed his routines, learned his absences, turned his solitude into a spectacle. The house beneath the stone vault, which he had built as a refuge from the world, had become an object of entertainment, a challenge to be tested and broken. He watched the footage a third time, this time without anger, without disbelief. He watched as one boy hesitated briefly before striking the door, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, quickly drowned by the encouragement of the others. That hesitation stayed with him. It told him something important. Fear existed there, buried beneath bravado. It could be reached. When the recording ended for the final time, he turned off the lamp and sat in darkness, listening to the slow creak of ice beneath the water and the distant murmur of the forest beyond the cavern. Winter pressed close, sealing the entrance with cold and shadow, but inside him something had shifted. The threat was no longer abstract. It had names, faces, habits. It could be anticipated. He thought briefly of the law, of carrying the recordings into town and placing them before the sheriff. The image played itself out easily enough. The skeptical looks, the careful words, the weight of small-town familiarity tipping the scales. He was the outsider who lived in a cave. They were local boys with families, histories, and excuses ready to be offered. Even with proof, justice would move slowly, if at all. By the time anything was decided, the house might already be ruined beyond repair. That understanding did not make him bitter. It made him practical. He rose before dawn the next morning and began to work. The first task was the walkway. He replaced the damaged boards with thicker planks, anchoring them not just with nails, but with bolts, driven deep into the supports beneath. He worked carefully, methodically, his breath fogging the air as he tightened each fastener. The walkway became heavier, less forgiving, something that would not yield easily to prying hands. Next came the canopy. He reinforced the posts with metal brackets, scavenged from old tools and supplies he had stored away for repairs. The wood and metal came together solidly, each joint strengthened beyond necessity. He wanted no weak points, no places where force alone could undo what he had built. Inside the house, he reinforced the doorframe, adding a steel plate along the edge where it had been struck before. The door itself remained wooden, unassuming, but behind its surface lay a strength that would answer violence with resistance rather than surrender. He did not rush. This was not frantic preparation but deliberate transformation. Each improvement was a statement, though no words were spoken. The house beneath the stone vault was no longer merely shelter. It was a line drawn in wood and metal. When night fell, he tested the lights he had installed along the canopy and walkway. Small motion sensors flared to life as he crossed their paths, bathing the platform and water in sudden brightness. The effect was stark, undeniable. Anyone approaching would be exposed, their movements stripped of the anonymity darkness provided. He adjusted angles, fine-tuned sensitivity, ensuring there would be no blind spots. He also strung thin lines of cord near the approach from the forest, each tied to small metal objects that would rattle loudly if disturbed. They were not traps meant to harm, only to announce. Silence had been his enemy for too long. Now it would serve him by breaking when touched. Days passed in tense quiet. Snow fell and settled, deepening the isolation. He continued his routines, though now each action carried an edge of expectation. He knew they would return. The boys' pride would not allow them to accept retreat quietly. Being watched, even unknowingly, would only sharpen their need to reclaim control. The return came on a night when the moon hung low and pale, its light spilling across the frozen water like a narrow path. He had come back from town earlier than usual, a decision made without conscious thought, guided perhaps by instinct more than reason. He extinguished the interior lamp and waited in the shadowed recess of the cavern, the stone cold against his back, the lantern unlit at his side. The first sound was faint, almost lost beneath the forest's breath. Then came the crunch of boots on snow, the unmistakable rhythm of human movement. The motion lights snapped on one by one, illuminating the walkway and platform in sudden bursts. 3 figures emerged, their outlines sharp against the glare. They froze, startled by the light, then laughed, though the sound was thinner than before. One of them stepped forward, testing the reinforced boards with a kick. The walkway did not give. Another raised a tool and struck a canopy post. The sound that answered was not the dull crack of splitting wood, but the ringing clang of metal. Confusion flickered across their faces. The confidence that had once carried them so easily faltered. That was when he stepped forward. He did not rush. He did not shout. He moved into the light with the steady assurance of someone who had chosen his moment carefully. The lantern in his hand cast a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the harsh white of the motion lights. His presence filled the space beneath the stone vault, his shadow stretching long across the water. They stared at him, momentarily unsure whether to run or stand their ground. One of them tightened his grip on the tool he carried, then loosened it again. Another took a step back, glancing toward the forest path as if measuring the distance. He said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The cameras blinked quietly, recording everything. The lights held them in place, stripping away the illusion of secrecy. For the first time, they understood that their actions had weight, that what they had done in laughter now stood exposed. The silence between them thickened, broken only by the distant creak of ice and the soft lap of water against stone. He took a single step forward, slow and deliberate. It was enough. The tool clattered to the ground. One by one, the boys turned away, retreating not with the reckless energy of before, but with awkward haste, stumbling slightly as they fled back into the trees. He watched them go, his face unreadable, his posture unmoving. When they were gone, the forest swallowing their shapes completely, he lowered the lantern and allowed himself a single, measured breath. The confrontation had ended without violence, without raised voices. It had ended because the balance had shifted. Later, inside the house, he reviewed the footage once more. He saw fear enter their expressions, saw the moment they realized they were no longer invisible. That was enough. The proof was complete, not only for others, but for himself. The silence returned to the cavern, but it was no longer the fragile quiet he had known before. It carried the weight of acknowledgement. He slept that night with the knowledge that the truth was no longer hidden, and that whatever came next, he would meet it with open eyes and steady hands. Morning came slowly beneath the stone vault, as if the cavern itself hesitated to release the night. Pale light filtered in from the forest, reflected off the frozen water, and carried softly into the house. He woke before dawn, not from fear this time, but from habit, his body attuned to the quiet changes of the place. For a long moment, he lay still, listening. There were no footsteps, no distant laughter, no sharp sounds carried through the stone. Only the low, steady murmur of the forest and the faint creak of ice settling beneath the water. He rose and stepped beneath the canopy. The platform was untouched. The reinforced walkway lay straight and solid, its boards clean except for a thin layer of snow. No new marks scarred the posts. The lights remained dark, untriggered through the night. For the first time in weeks, he felt a cautious release of tension, not relief exactly, but the easing of a weight that had pressed constantly against his chest. The confrontation of the night before replayed itself in his mind, not as a surge of triumph, but as a quiet confirmation. He had stood his ground. He had not shouted or chased or struck. He had simply been present, undeniable, and that had been enough to break the spell of anonymity the boys had relied upon. Still, he knew better than to assume it was finished. Fear could retreat, but pride often lingered. After breakfast, he sat at the table and reviewed the recordings once more. The images were clear, indisputable. Faces, movements, tools, intent. Everything was there. He copied the files carefully, storing them in more than one place, then packed the camera and the recordings away. The decision he had postponed now pressed firmly against him. The truth could no longer remain sealed within stone walls. The trip to town that day felt different from all the others. The road was still treacherous, the snow deep in places, but his mind was steady. When he parked near the sheriff's office, he did not hesitate. He carried the recordings inside without ceremony, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. The sheriff watched the footage in silence, his jaw tightening as the scenes unfolded. Others were called in, drawn by curiosity and unease. Word spread quickly. By the time the recording ended, the room was full of people who had once whispered about the man in the forest. Parents recognized faces they knew too well. Murmurs rose, arguments flared, then faltered beneath the undeniable weight of proof. He did not speak much. He answered questions plainly when asked, offering no embellishment, no accusation beyond what the images themselves showed. He felt no satisfaction in the discomfort that settled over the room. This was not revenge. It was exposure. The outcome was predictable, and yet altered by the evidence. Promises were made. Warnings would be issued. Consequences discussed. He did not expect justice in any grand sense, and he did not ask for it. What mattered had already been achieved. The silence around his home had been broken, and the truth had stepped into the open. When he returned to the forest that evening, the place greeted him with the same quiet dignity it always had. The stone vault loomed unchanged, ancient and indifferent to human disputes. The house stood firm beneath it, its reinforced structure bearing no sign of the recent struggle. He unloaded his supplies slowly, feeling no urgency, no need to rush inside and check for damage. The air itself felt calmer, as if the land recognized that a boundary had been drawn and respected. The days that followed passed without incident. Snow fell, settled, and melted slightly beneath the canopy, only to freeze again at night. No footsteps appeared on the walkway. No marks scarred the posts. The motion lights remained dormant, their silence a sign not of neglect, but of peace. He used the time to repair what damage remained, sanding rough edges, replacing boards that bore scars too deep to ignore. Each repair felt different now. He worked not with the weary resignation of someone fixing what would soon be broken again, but with the measured satisfaction of restoration. The house was no longer a target, it was a statement. As winter deepened, the forest grew quieter still. Animals moved cautiously, their tracks light and fleeting. Storms came and went, their fury softened by the stone. Inside the cavern, the house retained warmth, the stove's heat held gently by the surrounding rock. He found himself sitting beneath the canopy in the evenings, watching the slow shift of light across ice and snow, feeling the kind of stillness that did not demand vigilance. He thought sometimes of the boys, of how fear had finally reached them, cutting through their bravado. He wondered what they would remember of him, perhaps anger, perhaps shame, perhaps nothing at all. It no longer mattered. What mattered was that they had seen him not as a shadow or a curiosity, but as a man who would not yield what he had built. The town remained divided. Some greeted him with nods now, a quiet acknowledgement replacing the earlier distance. Others avoided his gaze, resentment lingering beneath their politeness. He accepted both responses with the same calm indifference. He had not chosen the forest to win approval. He had chosen it to live. One evening, as the winter sun dipped low and painted the frozen water in pale gold, he sat at the edge of the platform beneath the canopy. The air was sharp, clean, and still. He rested his hand against one of the posts, feeling the solidity of the wood beneath his palm, the hidden strength of metal reinforcing it. Above him, the stone vault rose in silent witness, unchanged by seasons, untroubled by human conflict. He understood then that the house was more than shelter. It was proof. Proof that endurance did not have to mean submission. Proof that solitude wasn't weakness, but a choice that required strength to defend. The stone had endured centuries of weather and time. The house, built beneath it, had endured its first true test. As night fell, and the stars pressed faintly against the dark opening of the cavern, he remained where he was, breathing slowly, listening to the world settle into itself. The struggle was over, not because the world had grown kinder, but because he had claimed his place within it. The silence that followed was no longer fragile. It was earned. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. More powerful stories are waiting for you in the next videos. Share this video with friends and family. Some stories deserve to be passed on.